So President Trump has taken control of certain elements in the National Guard and now ordered them to deploy to Portland and Chicago. He says this is necessary because local politicians there are scared for their lives from the domestic terrorists. Meanwhile, an Oregon judge appointed by President Trump temporarily blocked the deployments, saying the president's determination was, quote, simply untethered to the facts. So let's dive into what we know so far after a chaotic couple days here on the home front. This starts on September 27th when President Trump directed Secretary Hegseth to utilize military resources to assist in domestic operations if needed, saying, quote, at the request of the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, I'm directing Secretary of War Pete Hegseth to provide all necessary troops to protect war-ravaged Portland and any of our ICE facilities under siege from attack by Antifa and other domestic terrorists. I'm also authorizing full force if necessary. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Now, that statement kind of stands on its own in its uniqueness, but following that, there was a speech given by President Trump to all U.S. generals and admirals across the U.S. military as they gathered in Quantico, Virginia, where during the course of that speech, and we covered this in a video last week, President Trump talked about the enemy from within, dealing with radical Democrat cities and using some of those cities for training the military. I think these are some important clips. We'll run through them real quickly here to paint some context for other things we're going to hear in today's video. Here's President Trump talking with the top of the U.S. military just last week.
The ones that are run by the radical left Democrats, what they've done to San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, they're very unsafe places, and we're going to straighten them out one by one. And this is going to be a major part for some of the people in this room. That's a war, too. It's a war from within. Controlling the physical territory of our border is essential to national security. We have a very important mission. And I told Pete we should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military. Because we're going into Chicago very soon. That's a big city with an incompetent governor, stupid.
Now, in terms of the justification for the increase in military presence, really, in places like Portland and Chicago, we have a couple different statements here. I want to start out with one from the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. Here's what she had to say about this last week.
President Trump will end the radical left's reign of terror in Portland once and for all. The president has directed Secretary Hegseth to provide all necessary troops to protect war-ravaged Portland and any ICE facilities under siege from attack by Antifa and other left-wing domestic terrorists.
And then turning to Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, who has been all over the internet last couple days, to say the least, talking about this. He said, one of the many things he said, quote, ICE facilities are federal property conducting a federal mission of immigration enforcement that protects the lives and livelihoods of 300 million American citizens. It is a violent armed resistance, talking about what's happening in these cities, designed to incapacitate the essential operations of the duly elected federal government by force. Now, I want to mention that in today's video, we're going to be exclusively focused on the use of the United States military and National Guard on U.S. soil. There's a lot here that's happened in the last couple days. I mean, again, just in the last 48, 72 hours, we've had ICE and DHS raids, arrests of some American citizens, lots of protests, some that have even escalated into federal forces shooting somebody in Chicago this week, which is like not being anywhere nearly reported as much as I would have thought it would be. The challenge is from every single one of those, I'm watching very conflicting reports come out, and it's nerve-wracking, to be honest, that something like this, so significant, that requires the deployment of U.S. forces inside U.S. territory, and the reports are at the very least contradictory. We need to watch this, I would say. Now, fortunately, we're not seeing the 82nd Airborne deployed here or federal forces deployed here, active duty military deployed in the United States. It seems like that was in the cards, however, because just last week, we got a report that Anthony Salisbury, a top deputy to Stephen Miller, was observed using signal in a public place to discuss a plan to deploy the Army's 82nd Airborne to Portland. Quote, between you and I, these are his text messages, I think Pete, Secretary Hegseth, just wants top cover from the boss in case anything goes sideways with the troops there. The 82nd is our top-tier QRF, or Quick Reaction Force, for abroad, so it will cause a lot of headlines, probably why he wants Trump to tell him to do it. When asked about this, Abigail Jackson, a White House spokesperson, said, quote, Nothing in these private conversations that are shamefully being reported on by morally bankrupt reporters is new or classified information. Look, the deployment of the 82nd Airborne's Quick Reaction Force, it's a battalion they have on rotation that can get anywhere in the world in 18 hours. That's like a big thing in the 82nd. Incredible men and women in our armed forces. The idea that they would be utilized domestically because we have this rapid response necessary in a U.S. city, I feel like is an important piece of information. And that being brought up is not pushed back on. What's being pushed back on is that is being reported. Now, when turning to, we're going to start with Oregon and Portland and shift over to Chicago because we've got multiple cases of federalized National Guard troops now being deployed to U.S. cities. Starting with Oregon, President Trump talked about this just yesterday where he said, hey, look, that city, it's burning to the ground. Here we go.
We're going to look at that. It was amazing. Portland is burning to the ground. It's insurrectionists all over the place. It's Antifa. And yet the politicians who are petrified. Look, the politicians are afraid for their lives. That's the only reason that they say, like, there's nothing happening. And you've seen it. The place is burning down, and they pretend like there's nothing happening. So we'll take a look at the order. We haven't seen the order yet.
Now, at the beginning of that clip, you heard somebody mention the judge's order. And what happened as soon as President Trump, and there's been a lot here, so bear with me, when the Oregon Guard was federalized and then deployed to Portland, immediately, or the state of Oregon and the mayor, the governor and the mayor sued. And they came out and said, you can't do this. And U.S. District Judge Karen Immergut issued a statement here. And I think this is actually really important to pull a couple pieces out because she wrote it in a way that's pretty easy to understand. She said, quote, "This case involves the intersection of three of the most fundamental principles in our constitutional democracy. The first concerns the relationship between the federal government and the states. The second concerns the relationship between the United States Armed Forces and domestic law enforcement. The third concerns the proper role of the judicial branch in ensuring that the executive branch complies with the laws and limitations imposed by the legislative branch. Whether we choose to follow what the Constitution mandates with respect to these three relationships goes to the heart of what it means to live under the rule of law in the United States. This historical tradition boils down to a simple proposition. This is a nation of constitutional law, not martial law. Defendants have made a range of arguments that, if accepted, risk blurring the line between civil and military federal power to the detriment of this nation. The president is certainly entitled to a great level of deference in his determination that he is unable to, with the regular forces, to execute the laws of the United States. But a great level of deference is not equivalent to ignoring the facts on the ground. The president's determination was simply untethered to the facts." Now that order is still in place, and President Trump and Secretary Hegseth have so far not been able to deploy Oregon's National Guard or California's, which came up here as well. After the Oregon National Guard was stopped from deploying into Portland because the governor, who is in their direct chain of command, said, we don't need it. What's happening here? The U.S. government then shifted to California and said, if Oregon's not going to go, we're going to federalize California's Guard and send them in. But sticking with some statements here from officials in Oregon, the governor, Tina Kotek, said, quote, "The facts have not changed. There is no need for military intervention in Oregon. There's no insurrection in Portland, no threat to national security. Oregon is our home, not a military target. Oregonians exercising their freedom of speech against unlawful actions by the Trump administration should do so peacefully." And then a senior deputy city attorney for Portland who filed the lawsuit with let's see, Immergut. There we go. This is Caroline Turco, said, quote, "We ultimately have a perception versus reality problem. The perception is that it's World War II out here. The reality is that this is a beautiful city with a sophisticated resource that can handle the situation. There is no insurrection in Portland, no threat to national security, no fires, no bombs, no fatalities due to civil unrest. The only threat we face is to our democracy, and it is being led by President Trump." The Portland police chief, Bob Day, penned an op-ed in the Oregonian earlier today where he said, quote, "One block in Portland does not define a city's identity. Unfortunately, national portrayals often distort reality. Portland is 145 square miles, yet one city block has drawn outsized attention from news cycles. Viral clips, sometimes months or years old, paint a picture that is not consistent with the Portland we see every day. And as mentioned, with the blocking of the Oregon Guard being deployed into Portland, President Trump turned to California. Pentagon spokesperson Sean Parnell said in a statement on Sunday that the California National Guard were being reassigned from the Los Angeles area to Portland to, quote, support U.S. immigration and customs enforcement and other federal personnel performing official duties, including the enforcement of federal law and to protect federal property. Again, going to Abigail Jackson, the White House spokesperson, she said, quote, President Trump exercised his lawful authority to protect federal assets and personnel in Portland following violent riots and attacks on law enforcement. Again, this was met with another lawsuit. California Governor Gavin Newsom, who is the commander of those California National Guard troops, said this is a breathtaking abuse of law and power. The Trump administration is unapologetically attacking the rule of law itself and putting into action their dangerous words, ignoring court orders and treating judges, even those appointed by the president himself, as political opponents. We should mention that as that immigrant statement came out blocking the deployment of Oregon's National Guard to Portland, she was understandably attacked. And we should mention at this point that she was appointed to the bench by President Trump. And when they shifted and said, fine, we're going to send the California National Guard, that too was blocked by the same judge who came in late at night to file a temporary restraining order that was issued by California, saying, quote, this country has a long-standing and foundational tradition of resistance to government overreach, especially in the form of military intrusions into civil affairs. And she even made a comment like this is very clearly just trying to get around the first one, but the issue there still stands. That's Portland. While all of that is going on, again, not even getting into the mess of domestic issues with federal, state, and local law enforcement in Portland and Chicago, we have on October 3rd, the White House spokesperson Jackson said, quote, amidst ongoing violent riots and lawlessness that local leaders like Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker have refused to step in to quell, President Trump has now authorized 300 National Guardsmen to protect federal officers and assets. That's right. Try to keep up. We have the Oregon National Guard being federalized and sent to Portland. That was blocked. Then they said we're going to go with the California National Guard, federalized, move them in to Portland. That was blocked. And now we have the Illinois National Guard, not federalized. President Trump is threatening it. Governor Pritzker said, quote, it is absolutely outrageous and un-American to demand a governor send military troops within our own borders and against our will. He added that he was given an ultimatum by the Defense Department to call up your troops or we will. He said, quote, I want to be clear. There is no need for military troops on the ground in the state of Illinois. I will not call up our National Guard to further Trump's acts of aggression against our people. Now, President Trump's rationale for doing this, amongst many other statements, is that the politicians, especially J.B. Pritzker here, they're scared for their lives, suggesting that they would like to take this action, but they're scared to do so. Here's President Trump.
I believe the politicians are under threat because there's no way somebody can say that things are wonderful in Chicago. Almost 55, I think it was 55 people over a short period of time have been murdered in Chicago, have been shot. 222 people over a short period of time have been hit, have been wounded, not died. But 55 people died over a short period of time. You're telling me there's no city in the world like that. We're going to straighten it out. And I think that Pritzker, he's not a stupid person. I think that Pritzker's afraid for his life.
So now that Illinois is not calling up their National Guard, they said, fine, we'll call up Texas. Secretary Hegseth put out a note saying, quote, on October 4th, 2025, the president determined that violent incidents, as well as the credible threat of continued violence, are impeding the execution of the laws of the United States in Illinois, Oregon, and other locations throughout the United States. The president has authorized me to coordinate with you on the mobilization of up to 400 members of the Texas National Guard. The orders will be effective immediately for a period of 60 days and subject to extension to perform federal protection missions where needed, including the cities of Portland and Chicago. This was welcomed by Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who said, quote, to Illinois Governor Pritzker, you can either fully enforce protection for federal employees or get out of the way and let the Texas Guard do it. Governor Pritzker responded by saying this evening President Trump is ordering 400 members of the Texas National Guard for deployments to Illinois, Oregon, and other locations within the United States. No officials from the federal government called me directly to discuss or coordinate. We must now start calling this what it is, Trump's invasion. It started with federal agents. It will soon include deploying federalized military members of the Illinois National Guard against our wishes. And it will now involve sending in another state's military troops. I call on Governor Abbott to immediately withdraw any support for this decision and refuse to coordinate. There is no reason a president should send military troops into a sovereign state without their knowledge, consent, or cooperation. The brave men and women who serve in our National Guards must not be used as political props. This is a moment where every American must speak up and help us to stop this madness. There's elements to this that I feel like we need to keep an eye on. Using federal law enforcement like ICE and DHS, FBI, Border Patrol, things like that across the country is something that the U.S. government has the full right to do. The federal government has that. Those are federal law enforcement personnel. They can go anywhere in the country. We've veered into a new category. When you start to call up the National Guard, it's definitely an escalation. And I voiced my objection in past videos that I think the use of our military inside the United States, we need to be so overly careful with how that is done that limiting it to things like disaster relief is probably best case. That is a great use for our men and women in uniform in the National Guard that have raised their hand, volunteered to protect their communities. I think that is an excellent resource for the National Guard. We start to blur those lines when we get into crowd control and riot control. It's just, to put it bluntly, that's not what the National Guard is trained in. And we saw it in California where they all had to go through training to figure out how to carry those riot shields, how to deploy in some of those areas. It's not, personally, I don't think, a great use of our military. When we start moving troops from one state into troops of another state against the will of that governor and local politicians, I feel like that's very dangerous territory. This is something we've seen in other places around the world where you do not have neighbors crack down on neighbors because they know each other and they don't want to upset people they're going to have to live with when this is over. But when you pull somebody from somewhere else that has never seen these people before, they're others. They're from a different state. It's a different community. They've never been there before. It is easier to not have the same level of compassion that I would hope we have for our fellow American citizens. So this is a lot happening very, very fast. And it's something worth keeping an eye on. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.